Amelia Sterling thought the evening in Manhattan was a quiet contract signing until the single father beside her leaned close and whispered 4 words, "Don't look behind you." In the glass wall's reflection, she saw 3 men in dark suits closing in. Mason Reed did not panic, did not call for security, and did not raise his voice. He simply rested his hand on a folded napkin as though every possible exit had already been mapped before tonight. When the lights cut out moments later, Amelia finally understood that the quiet, poor man beside her was not ordinary at all. If you truly love breathless stories about quiet heroes hiding in plain sight, stay with us until the very end. The restaurant sat near the top of a glass tower in Manhattan, the kind of place where the city below looked like a field of scattered light, and every table seemed to float above the noise of ordinary life. Amelia Sterling arrived exactly on time, dressed the way a chief executive was expected to dress, calm on the surface and exhausted underneath. She had come to meet a group of international investors who might still save a clean energy project that had been quietly dying for months. Outside, the skyline glittered as it always did, but inside the dining room the air felt colder than it should have, tighter, the kind of silence that arrives before something breaks. Something had felt wrong from the moment she walked through the door. Her reservation had been changed at the last minute without explanation, and instead of the private corner she always requested, she was seated near a service exit, close to a door most guests never noticed. A message from her assistant, Hannah Cross, said she could not make it because the office elevators had locked without warning, a strange excuse that did not sit well in Amelia's stomach. Amelia told herself this was simply another stressful evening among many, the kind a woman who ran a company learned to absorb without flinching. At a small table near the service counter sat a man who did not belong in a restaurant like this one. Mason Reed wore a worn jacket that had seen too many winters, and he ordered black coffee and the cheapest pastry on the menu, eating slowly like someone who had ducked inside only to escape the rain. A few of the staff glanced at him with quiet disdain, the kind reserved for people who looked out of place among marble floors and silver trays. He looked like an exhausted single father who had finished a long shift and wandered in for a moment of warmth, nothing more. Amelia noticed him almost by accident because unlike everyone else in the room, he never once looked at his phone. Instead, his eyes moved in slow, deliberate sweeps, tracing the exits, the angle of the windows, the position of the cameras mounted near the ceiling, the rhythm of the waitstaff moving between tables. It was a habit buried so deep in his body that it no longer looked like watching at all. It simply looked like breathing. Amelia did not understand what she was seeing. She assumed he was simply a poor man, lost amid a world far too expensive for him. Her investors arrived late, 3 men in dark suits whose posture did not match the easy confidence of typical businessmen. One wore a nearly invisible earpiece tucked behind his collar. Another kept glancing toward his sleeve as though checking something hidden there. The third never touched his water glass, his attention fixed entirely on Amelia rather than on the conversation unfolding around the table. A chill crept up Amelia's spine that she could not explain, the kind of unease that arrives without evidence and refuses to leave. Mason noticed the same wrongness, though he gave no outward sign of it. He did not approach right away. Instead, he turned his coffee cup slightly, just enough to catch the dining room's reflection in the dark surface behind Amelia's seat, watching everything without ever appearing to watch at all. When a server dropped a tray of glasses near her table, the 3 men did not flinch the way ordinary people flinch at sudden noise. Their stillness was too practiced, too complete, and Mason understood in that instant that nothing about this evening was an accident. This was not a business meeting. It was something else entirely, something already in motion long before Amelia had walked through the door. Amelia bent forward and signed the first page of a contract she did not yet know was a trap, while behind her 3 men rose from their seats without a sound. Mason rose from his table without hurry, moving in a wide arc around the service counter rather than walking straight toward Amelia, careful to stay clear of the main camera mounted near the entrance. A server stepped forward to stop him, assuming he meant to bother an important guest, but Mason simply sewed a few bills on the counter and asked politely for a clean napkin. He drifted closer to Amelia as though he had merely wandered past her table by accident, nothing more than a stranger weaving through a crowded room. When he reached her shoulder, he bent down quickly and spoke 4 quiet words. "Don't look behind you." Amelia froze. Her first instinct was to turn, but something in his voice, low and impossibly calm, held her in place before she could move. Mason laid the folded napkin near the edge of her plate, then folded it again into a small triangle with 2 fingers, angling it so that the motion of his lips stayed hidden from anyone watching. He told her, without moving his mouth more than necessary, to look at the glass panel on her left instead of turning her head. Amelia followed his instruction and saw 3 men advancing, slow and deliberate. One man's hand had slipped inside his jacket. Another now blocked the path toward the elevator bank. The third gestured toward a member of the staff, who quietly reached over and lowered the music until it nearly disappeared. The rest of the restaurant kept talking, kept laughing, completely unaware that danger had already entered the room. Amelia felt her heartbeat slam against her ribs. She asked Mason, in a whisper barely audible, who he was. He did not answer the question directly. Instead, he told her that if she wanted to live through the next few minutes, she needed to do exactly 3 things. First, do not stand up quickly. Second, do not reach for her purse. Third, when a glass fell to the floor, drop down immediately without hesitation. Amelia thought for half a second that the man beside her had lost his mind, but something deeper than reason told her to listen anyway, the same instinct that keeps people alive long before their minds catch up. One of the 3 men called Amelia's name with practiced politeness, claiming her partners were waiting in a private room just down the hall. Mason smiled faintly, playing the part of a clumsy stranger, and reached toward a nearby table as if to steady himself, his hand closing instead around a half-full glass of water. At that exact moment, Caleb Moore, the head of Amelia's internal security team, appeared near the entrance. Relief flickered through her for one brief instant until she noticed that Caleb made no move to alert the rest of his team. Caleb simply looked toward the 3 men and gave the smallest nod imaginable, a gesture so slight that almost no one else in the room would have caught it. Mason caught it. In that single nod, he understood that the people meant to protect Amelia had already been bought, and that there was no longer any time left to think things through carefully. He let the glass slip from his fingers, and it shattered loudly against the marble floor. The sound sent Amelia dropping low exactly as he had told her to, and a hand meant for the back of her neck swept through empty air instead. Mason used a fallen serving tray to block the attacker's wrist, the motion fast and economical, nothing like the dramatic violence people imagined when they pictured danger. To everyone else nearby, it looked like nothing more than an awkward collision between 2 clumsy strangers. Mason pulled Amelia back into the narrow space between 2 tables and told her again not to look directly at the men closing in, because panic spreads faster than fire, and a frightened crowd made her easier to drag away unseen. Amelia began to understand that Mason was not simply lucky. He was reading the entire room the way a soldier reads a map, and a moment later the restaurant's lights cut to black, leaving only the glow of the city reflected across the windows. In the sudden darkness, screams rippled through the dining room as people stumbled into chairs and into one another. The 3 men used the chaos to push closer to Amelia, weaving through frightened guests with disturbing calm. Mason did not fight loudly or draw attention to himself. Instead, he used tables, curtains, serving carts, and the narrow gaps between furniture to separate the men from one another, breaking their formation piece by piece without anyone realizing what was happening. He pulled Amelia toward the kitchen rather than the main entrance, and she resisted for a moment, certain the elevator was the faster way out. Mason told her the elevator was the first trap waiting to close around her. She did not believe him until she glimpsed Caleb standing near the elevator doors with a radio pressed to his ear, exactly where Mason said he would be. He guided her instead through the delivery corridor behind the kitchen. A young cook nearly screamed at the sight of them bursting through the doors. But Mason simply said there had been an electrical failure, his voice flat and certain enough that the staff obeyed without question, parting out of his way as though he belonged there. One of the pursuing men charged into the kitchen behind them. Mason used steam rising from a large pot to blur the man's vision for a few crucial seconds, then sealed the heavy door of an industrial walk-in cooler just long enough to slow him down. None of it required anything impossible, only a clear understanding of the space around him and the discipline to use it without wasted motion. Amelia ran beside him, breathing hard, unused to being hunted. She was a woman who controlled boardrooms, not someone who fled down service corridors in the dark, and the unfamiliarity of it frightened her almost as much as the men chasing them. Mason kept just enough distance to protect her without crowding her, careful never to grab her more than necessary, and that restraint, oddly, made her trust him a little more. They reached the emergency stairwell, and Mason stopped so abruptly that Amelia nearly collided with his back. He pointed at a thin layer of dust along the steps below them. There were fresh footprints heading upward but none heading down, which meant someone was already waiting on the floor beneath them, patient and silent. He pulled her back toward the upper landing instead. Amelia asked how he could possibly know all of this, and Mason answered only that he once had a job that required noticing danger before it ever announced itself. They heard Caleb's voice crackle through a radio somewhere nearby, ordering every exit on the floor sealed immediately. Amelia understood then that this was not a robbery or a random act of violence aimed at strangers. It was a plan built entirely around her, with every detail considered weeks or months in advance. Mason led her into an employee changing room, where he swapped his worn jacket for a spare staff uniform hanging on a hook, just enough to confuse the cameras tracking their movement. Amelia had to remove her heels to move faster, an awkward, almost embarrassing detail that somehow made everything feel painfully real. Mason handed her a spare pair of plain work shoes from a shelf, and she hesitated, never having been asked to make a decision like this before in her life. He told her plainly that her title would not save her tonight, only quick decisions would, and for the first time that evening she set her pride aside and listened. They slipped out through a side delivery door leading down into the underground parking garage, hoping for a clear path to safety. Instead, when the door swung open, two black sport utility vehicles sat waiting in the shadows below, engines silent, doors already open as though expecting them. Mason eased Amelia back into the darkness of the doorway, and below them the waiting men began to spread out, searching the garage in slow, deliberate sweeps for any sign of movement. The underground garage stretched out cold and wide, its fluorescent lights flickering in uneven pulses. Mason and Amelia crouched behind a row of parked cars, catching their breath in the chemical smell of concrete and exhaust. Amelia reached for her phone to call the police, but the screen showed no signal at all, an emptiness that made no sense in the middle of Manhattan. Mason checked it quickly and found a small device hidden inside the back of her phone case, something designed to jam outgoing signals without anyone noticing. Amelia went pale because that exact case had been issued to her months earlier by her own internal security team. It confirmed, beyond any doubt, that Caleb Moore had betrayed her. Mason removed the device carefully but did not discard it. Instead, he slipped it into an automated trash receptacle nearby, letting it continue broadcasting a false location while they moved elsewhere unseen. The men hunting them would follow a signal that led nowhere useful, buying precious minutes neither of them could afford to waste. Amelia turned to Mason and asked, with a sharper edge in her voice now, exactly who he was and how he knew so much. Mason still would not give her the full truth. He told her his name was Mason Reed, a father simply trying to live a quiet life. Something about the name tugged at her memory, and she realized she had seen it once in a stack of vendor records, a small maintenance crew her company had refused to pay on time months earlier. Shame flooded through her, because back then his name had been nothing more than a line item buried inside a budget report she barely remembered approving. Mason did not blame her for it. He simply said that tonight was not the moment for apologies. They made their way toward Amelia's car, only to find it locked from somewhere far away, its interior camera glowing to life on its own as though someone unseen had switched it on remotely. Mason understood immediately that the vehicle's entire system had been compromised long before tonight. A call rang through the car's dashboard screen, and Connor Blake's face appeared, calm, composed, almost gentle in tone. Connor told Amelia that all she needed to do was sign a short set of documents transferring temporary voting control, and the entire ordeal would end quietly. He warned her that resistance would only invite fabricated evidence of embezzlement straight into the hands of eager journalists. Amelia's anger rose, but so did her fear, because Connor clearly understood every weak point hidden inside her company. Mason studied the background behind Connor's face on the screen and noticed faint details, a distant rumble of passing trains, a particular slant of fluorescent light, signs of an old data storage facility somewhere across the river in Brooklyn. It was a small detail, the kind only a trained eye would ever catch, and it revealed just how closely Mason was capable of reading a single frame of video. Connor spotted Mason through the car's camera and sneered, calling him a poor handyman who had wandered into matters far beyond his understanding. Mason said nothing in response. He simply pressed a small scrap of metal against the camera lens until static swallowed the screen completely, cutting Connor off mid-sentence. Amelia asked why Connor wanted control of her company so badly, and Mason offered a quiet theory that her clean energy project had never actually failed on its own merit. It had been sabotaged deliberately from within, because its true value was far greater than anyone outside the company realized, valuable enough that someone wanted to sell it quietly to a foreign buyer. Amelia realized the entire dinner had been engineered from the start, a careful trap built to pressure her into signing under fear rather than reason. Mason found an old delivery van left unlocked nearby, its ignition loose enough to bypass with a simple fix, nothing illegal beyond borrowing a vehicle that belonged to the restaurant in a moment of genuine emergency. They sped out of the garage, and the two black sport utility vehicles pulled out behind them through the exit ramp, headlights sweeping across the concrete walls like searchlights hunting for prey. Mason guided the borrowed delivery van through rain-slicked streets, weaving between the lights of Manhattan with calm precision. Amelia sat beside him, still trembling but forcing her mind to stay sharp despite the fear coursing through her body. The two black vehicles stayed close behind, never quite losing them, their headlights cutting steady lines through the falling rain. Mason did not drive with reckless flair the way action films often imagined. He used his knowledge of one-way streets, stalled traffic, construction barriers, and slow-moving delivery trucks to peel away from pursuit patiently and methodically. Amelia noticed that Mason was not merely reacting to danger as it came. He seemed to anticipate the next move of the men chasing them several steps in advance. When one vehicle attempted to force them toward the curb, Mason slowed at exactly the right instant instead of accelerating, letting their pursuer slide past the intersection without making contact. He always avoided endangering pedestrians or other drivers, a quiet discipline that revealed a man guided by principle rather than desperation. Amelia finally asked why he was risking so much to save her, when her own company had once treated him so poorly. Mason answered simply that he was not protecting a job title. He was protecting a person being hunted, nothing more complicated than that. The honesty in his voice silenced her for a long moment. During a brief stretch of empty road, Mason handed her a spare phone borrowed from a delivery worker's bag so she could try reaching Joseph Vale, her personal lawyer. Joseph did not answer, which unsettled Amelia deeply, since he always picked up no matter the hour. Mason suggested quietly that Joseph might already be under watch himself, a possibility that chilled her further. Going to the police immediately was not an option, not when Connor had already prepared falsified evidence and clearly controlled someone deep inside her own security division. Mason decided to bring Amelia somewhere temporary and safe, a small repair workshop he kept in Queens, far removed from anywhere Connor might expect to look. Amelia found it strange, almost surreal, that a chief executive of her standing now had to hide inside a modest mechanic's shop rather than anywhere resembling comfort or luxury. Mason told her plainly that comfortable places were exactly where Connor held the most influence. His workshop was small, worn at the edges, but kept with remarkable order. A faded city map covered one wall, alongside mechanical tools, an old radio set, and a handful of technical folders stacked neatly on a shelf. A single small chair sat tucked into one corner, though no child appeared anywhere in the scene, only the faintest suggestion that Mason carried a private life beyond these walls. He locked the door, switched off the outside light, and activated a homemade alarm system rigged from spare wiring and old sensors. Amelia noticed a photograph lying face down on a nearby table and chose not to turn it over, respecting whatever privacy it represented. Mason cleaned a shallow scrape along her arm without ceremony, and for a moment the frantic pace of the night slowed enough for something quieter to surface between them. Amelia apologized for the unpaid contracts her company had left behind for his crew, and Mason admitted he had grown used to being overlooked by people with power, though his eyes carried weariness rather than bitterness. For the first time, Amelia began to see something gentle hiding beneath his guarded calm. Mason switched on his old radio and scanned through several frequencies until he caught a fragment of Caleb's voice, reporting that Amelia had already been cut off from every reliable line of communication. By morning, the board intended to call an emergency session declaring her unfit to lead the company. If Amelia could not return with solid proof before sunrise, she stood to lose everything she had built. Mason stated plainly that hiding would not be enough. They needed to move before dawn and find proof strong enough to expose the truth. Amelia asked Mason to tell her the truth before she trusted him with her life one more time that night. Mason stayed silent for a long while, choosing his words with the care of someone who had buried this story on purpose. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no pride, only a quiet, worn honesty. Years earlier, he had worked within a specialized best protection unit, the kind tasked with moving witnesses, scientists, and executives safely out of ambushes shaped by political or financial interests. He had never been a man who hurt people for a living. He had been a man whose entire purpose was keeping others alive. During his final assignment, sensitive information had leaked from somewhere inside his own organization. Mason had managed to save the person he was protecting, but the operation cost him a close friend and left him labeled as the one responsible for the failure. His official records were sealed away soon afterward, his name quietly erased from a world that no longer wanted to acknowledge him. He left that life behind entirely, taking small repair jobs and living without attention, simply trying to raise a child in peace. The outline never placed his child directly into any scene, only the unspoken weight of fatherhood that kept him from chasing danger again. Amelia finally understood why he carried himself with such restraint. He was not afraid of confrontation itself. He was afraid of becoming, once again, the man he had worked so hard to leave behind. In turn, Amelia shared pieces of her own history, how she had inherited Sterling Global after her father's sudden death, how everyone assumed she had inherited comfort along with the company, when in truth the board had doubted her from the very beginning. Connor Blake had once been the man she trusted most inside the organization, the one who helped her steady the company through its earliest crisis. Slowly, without her noticing, he had taken control of the information flowing toward her until she could barely see past him at all. Amelia realized this betrayal had not begun that single night. It had been building quietly for months, perhaps longer. Mason asked if there was anyone left she trusted without reservation. Amelia thought immediately of Hannah Cross, her loyal and sharp assistant, though Hannah had been unreachable for hours now. Mason offered to check public traffic cameras near the office tower using an old computer kept in the corner of his workshop, a modest tool compared to anything Connor's people likely possessed. What they found troubled them deeply. Hannah had never been trapped inside a stalled elevator at all. She had been quietly removed through a staff exit, taken somewhere far from the cameras that might have recorded her path. Amelia's fear sharpened into something closer to dread, certain that Hannah might now be held as leverage against her. Mason reasoned that Connor needed two specific things to finish whatever he was planning: Amelia's signature and a verification code only Hannah could provide, since Hannah oversaw the scheduling of access to sensitive company data. This meant their next move had become unmistakably clear: find Hannah before Connor forced her to unlock anything further. Mason suspected the old data facility in Brooklyn might be exactly where she was being kept. Amelia insisted on going with him. Mason resisted at first, worried about the danger waiting there. But Amelia reminded him that this was her company, her employee, and her responsibility for ever allowing Connor this much room to maneuver. Mason looked at her then and saw something different from the woman who had walked into the restaurant earlier that evening. No longer simply a proud executive, but someone learning, in real time, what it meant to carry responsibility. They prepared to leave the workshop, just as the quiet sound of tires rolling to a careful stop reached them from somewhere outside. Mason cut every light inside the workshop in a single motion. Amelia instinctively moved toward the window to look outside, but Mason pulled her back gently and repeated his earlier warning in a lower, harder voice. "Don't look behind you." This time she understood immediately what he meant. Through a small mirror mounted on the wall, she caught the faint outline of a figure approaching the rear door. Connor's people had found the workshop. Mason guessed quickly that the tracking device was not hidden in Amelia's phone at all, but inside the smartwatch she still wore, a gift Connor had given her during a board meeting months earlier. Amelia tore it off her wrist, furious at how easily she had carried her own betrayal without realizing it. Mason placed the watch onto an old automated floor-cleaning robot he had built years earlier and sent it rolling toward a side door, letting the men outside believe she was hiding in that direction instead. He used an old radio trick to scatter false chatter across their frequency, splitting their search into smaller, less coordinated groups. He had no intention of fighting inside a workshop filled with flammable materials and old machinery. Instead, he guided Amelia down into a narrow maintenance crawl space beneath the floor, away from the main room entirely. One man broke through the front door first. Mason used the darkness, a length of pull cord from the rolling shutter, and a nearby fire extinguisher to subdue him quickly and quietly. A second man tried to come from behind, and Amelia nearly cried out a warning, but Mason had already sensed him coming before she could speak. He locked the man's arm and shoved him sideways into a stack of soft tires to muffle the impact. Amelia watched the entire sequence unfold in stunned silence. There was nothing excessive in his movements, nothing performed for show. Every motion existed only to end the threat as quickly and quietly as possible. Caleb Moore appeared in the doorway then, gun lowered but not yet raised, and told Mason he had no idea what kind of people he was standing against. Mason answered calmly that men who needed to drag a woman into darkness just to force a signature were rarely as powerful as they pretended to be. Caleb's jaw tightened with anger. Amelia stepped out from her hiding place and faced him directly, demanding to know why he had betrayed her after everything. Caleb admitted that Connor had promised him a position as global head of security, along with enough money to disappear entirely. Amelia realized with quiet clarity that loyalty bought with money had never truly been loyalty at all. Mason triggered the rolling shutter unexpectedly, separating Caleb from the rest of his men before anyone could regroup. They did not detain Caleb immediately. Instead, they used the moment to press him for information. Caleb finally admitted that Hannah was being held at the old data facility across the river in Brooklyn. He also revealed that Connor had already prepared a false media story, claiming Amelia had vanished with a man who carried a record of violent behavior. Mason understood instantly that Connor intended to use his own past as the very weapon meant to destroy Amelia's credibility. This realization raised the stakes considerably. If they failed now, Amelia would lose her company entirely, Hannah's life could be at risk, and Mason would be dragged back into the darkest corner of his own history. Mason and Amelia slipped out through the rear of the workshop, carrying Caleb's radio with them as their only remaining clue. Mason and Amelia reached the old data storage facility in Brooklyn just before dawn. The area felt abandoned, surrounded by chain-link fencing, outdated cameras, and the distant rumble of passing trains echoing through empty streets. Mason studied the placement of the guards stationed around the perimeter and recognized a pattern that suggested amateur muscle being directed by someone with genuine tactical experience. That detail alone told him Connor had outside guidance helping shape this entire operation. Amelia wanted to call the police immediately, desperate to end the nightmare as quickly as possible. Mason explained that they needed solid proof first, because if officers arrived too early, Connor would simply erase the data and twist the story to make Hannah appear as though she had come there willingly. They used Caleb's radio to monitor patrol schedules, listening carefully for gaps in coverage. Mason led Amelia through a maintenance corridor running alongside the building's electrical lines, avoiding the main entrance entirely. Along the way, Amelia proved far from helpless. She recalled the architecture of her own company's data systems and pointed out that a secondary server room likely held a backup copy of certain contracts. Mason found himself growing increasingly impressed by her sharp memory and steady thinking under pressure. They found Hannah locked inside a small glass-walled room near the center of the facility. She was conscious but visibly shaken, forced to attempt unlocking the system using her access credentials. Connor was not physically present in the room itself. He was directing everything remotely from a separate control office elsewhere in the building. Mason created a brief, localized power failure to override the door's lock mechanism, giving Amelia just enough time to rush inside and reach Hannah. Hannah broke into tears, certain that Amelia had been captured as well. Amelia apologized deeply for allowing Hannah to be placed in such danger in the first place. A quiet but significant turning point for a woman who had once led almost entirely from a place of cold detachment. Hannah revealed that Connor's plan went far beyond simple control of the company. He had already pre-sold the core clean energy technology to a secretive group of outside investors. If the sale went through, thousands of employees at Sterling Global stood to lose their jobs, while Amelia herself would likely be blamed for leaking confidential data. Joseph Vale, Amelia's personal lawyer, had been silenced by threats involving private medical records belonging to his wife. Mason asked Hannah whether there remained any other path into the system. Hannah explained that a separate cold storage server existed, one that could only be unlocked using executive authority alongside Joseph's legal verification code. Amelia realized with sudden hope that Joseph might not have betrayed her at all. He had simply been forced into silence. Mason noticed a folder resting on a nearby desk containing photographs of himself. Connor had clearly investigated Mason thoroughly after realizing he had intervened to protect Amelia at the restaurant. Inside the folder sat a single declassified page describing how Mason had once taken part in protecting witnesses during a defense-related corruption case years earlier. Amelia understood instantly that Connor intended to twist this fragment of Mason's past into something far more sinister than it ever was. Mason's expression turned cold, unsettled by the idea of his old life being dragged into the light once again. Connor's voice cut through a nearby speaker, suggesting Mason should walk away now if he still hoped to protect the quiet life he had built. He hinted indirectly at Mason's responsibilities as a father, though no child ever appeared directly within the scene itself. That single remark nearly shattered Mason's composure. Amelia stepped forward instead, telling Connor plainly that a man who attacked someone's family to gain leverage had no honor left to speak of at all. Mason steadied himself, drawing strength from her unexpected defense. Together, they managed to copy a portion of the hidden data, but the system soon detected the intrusion, triggering an alarm that echoed through the entire facility. Connor sealed every exit and ordered his remaining men to bring Amelia directly up to his control room. Amelia was separated from Mason and Hannah and brought directly into the control room, where Connor Blake waited alongside Joseph Vale. Joseph sat pale and silent at a nearby desk, clearly forced into stillness against his will. Connor placed the voting transfer documents in front of Amelia, calm and almost gentle in tone. He told her that one signature would end everything quietly, Hannah would be released, Joseph would be left alone, and Mason would be allowed to walk away unharmed. Amelia understood she was being handed a cruel and deliberate choice. Connor turned on a large nearby screen and played a polished, fabricated news segment he had clearly prepared well in advance. It portrayed Amelia as an unstable executive who had fled the city with a former contractor possessing a violent record. Mason's old file had been twisted and stripped of context to make him appear dangerous rather than honorable. Connor wanted Amelia to believe she had no remaining options left. Meanwhile, deep within the lower levels of the facility, Mason and Hannah pushed toward the cold storage server room. Hannah was injured but still managed to guide him carefully through the final stretch of corridors. Mason discovered that the locking mechanism could not simply be forced open through strength alone. It required Joseph's legal verification code to proceed. Mason used Caleb's old radio to open a hidden audio pathway directly into the control room above them. He let Joseph hear his voice clearly through the static. Rather than delivering some grand speech, Mason offered him a single short reminder that if he stayed silent now, the truth would die along with that signature. Joseph's hands trembled visibly. Connor threatened him openly, raising his voice for the first time that night. Amelia turned toward Joseph and told him she was not asking him to sacrifice his family, only to remember why her father had trusted him in the first place. Something in her words finally reached him. Joseph stood against Connor and recited the legal verification code aloud. Far below, Hannah unlocked the cold storage server successfully. The true data appeared at last, undeniable proof of everything Connor had done. It documented bribes accepted, falsified reports, the hired men sent after Amelia Caleb's corruption, and the secret plan to sell critical technology to outside buyers. Connor's composure shattered the instant he realized what had happened. He ordered the entire server wiped immediately. Mason had only moments to get Hannah safely away before the system overloaded completely. On their way back up, 3 men ambushed them in a narrow corridor, forcing Mason into the most intense confrontation of the entire night. He moved with precise control, using flickering light, steel door frames, hanging cables, and the tight confines of the hallway to his advantage. He disabled each man carefully without taking a single life, a deliberate choice that kept him firmly rooted as a protector rather than someone seeking revenge. Above, inside the control room, Amelia used Connor's brief distraction to avoid signing the documents in front of her. Connor seized her wrist and tried forcing the pen into her hand by sheer strength. At that exact moment, Mason appeared beyond the glass wall, having broken through every obstacle Connor's men had placed in his path. Connor mocked him one final time, calling him nothing more than a forgotten poor father overlooked by the world. Mason didn't charge forward recklessly, not while Amelia remained in danger. He looked at her through the glass and spoke softly, echoing the very first words he had ever said to her. "Don't look behind him, look at his right hand." Amelia saw then that Connor was gripping a small device designed to trigger a complete data wipe. She drove her pen sharply into his hand, knocking the device loose onto the floor. Mason broke through the door an instant later and restrained Connor completely. Before security could fully secure him, Connor laughed coldly, claiming the stolen data had already been scheduled for release. If they failed to stop it within minutes, the technology would still be sold, and Amelia would still be blamed for everything. A countdown began glowing ominously across the main server screen. Mason, Amelia, Hannah, and Joseph had only minutes to work together before the stolen data reached its intended destination. Hannah fought to intercept the outgoing transmission, while Joseph quickly assembled a legal evidence package meant for both federal authorities and the company's board of directors. Amelia needed to log in using her executive credentials, but Connor had already locked her biometric access through an emergency override before his capture. Mason realized there was still one remaining path forward, an old manual recovery system housed deep within the cold storage server room. It required the chief executive to correctly answer 3 security questions, originally set in place by Amelia's father before his death. Amelia's fear deepened immediately, since she and her father had grown distant in his final years, and she doubted she would remember any of the answers at all. This moment carried far more emotional weight than any of the physical danger she had faced earlier that night. The first question asked about the exact moment she had chosen to remain with the company rather than sell her shares years ago. She answered correctly without hesitation. The second question referenced the final words her father had left behind in a private letter, and her voice caught in her throat before the answer finally surfaced through quiet tears. The third question asked who her father trusted to protect the company whenever every official title and position eventually failed. Amelia assumed instinctively that the answer pointed to a board member, someone with rank or formal authority. Joseph then revealed that her father had quietly changed this particular answer following a security crisis many years earlier. Mason glanced at an old file and noticed his own name listed among former protective consultants once retained by Amelia's father. It turned out that her father had once known Mason personally, long before Amelia herself had ever crossed paths with him. Mason had rescued him years earlier from a dangerous ambush rooted in corporate espionage before disappearing from that world entirely. Her father had never told Amelia, choosing silence in order to protect Mason from being pulled back into a life he had deliberately left behind. The answer to the final question was Mason Reed. Amelia typed his name into the recovery field and the system finally unlocked. This single revelation carried enormous weight because Mason had not simply stumbled into Amelia's life by chance. He had quietly remained, in some distant way, the very person her father had trusted most, even after death. The recovered data flooded back into view, complete and untouched. Hannah transmitted every piece of evidence to federal authorities, respected journalists, and the company's board without delay. Joseph signed the legal confirmation required to validate everything they had gathered. The countdown on the main screen froze with mere seconds remaining. Connor attempted to flee amid the surrounding chaos. Caleb appeared briefly, hoping to rescue Connor in exchange for whatever payments still remained on the table. David Shaw, a former federal investigator who had once received an urgent message from Mason hours earlier, arrived alongside a team of law enforcement officers just in time. Both Caleb and Connor were taken into custody on the spot. Connor shouted desperately that Amelia could never prove her own innocence. At that exact moment, every screen inside the boardroom upstairs lit up with the full transaction records, audio recordings, and security footage captured from inside the restaurant earlier that night. The truth no longer remained hidden from anyone. Amelia did not crumble beneath the weight of everything she had endured. She stood tall, watching as Connor was led away in handcuffs, feeling no satisfaction in his downfall, only quiet resolve. She told him plainly that he had mistaken control over others for genuine power, and that mistake had finally cost him everything. Daylight broke gently over Brooklyn, and Mason stepped quietly outside, asking for no thanks and expecting none. A few days later, Sterling Global held a public press conference. Amelia openly accepted responsibility for allowing the company's internal systems to be manipulated so thoroughly. She refused to place all the blame on Connor simply to protect her own public image. She announced a complete restructuring of the security division, a full audit of every delayed contractor payment, and direct compensation for the small vendors her company had once treated unfairly, including the crew Mason had once belonged to. Journalists soon learned that Mason had saved the chief executive, protected vital company data, and ultimately preserved thousands of jobs. Mason, however, refused every interview request that followed. He returned quietly to his small workshop, hoping simply to return to an ordinary, peaceful life. Amelia visited him there a few days afterward, arriving without bodyguards and without cameras trailing behind her. She wore something simpler than usual, a quiet sign of how much she had changed since that night. Mason was working beneath an old engine when she arrived, grease staining his hands. She handed him a sealed envelope, and he assumed at first that it contained some kind of financial reward, immediately preparing to decline it out of habit. Amelia clarified that it was not a reward at all. It was a formal contract inviting him to lead an independent crisis protection unit for Sterling Global, structured entirely on his own terms, allowing him to set every boundary, choose his own team, and never again be forced to sacrifice the quiet life he had built for himself. Mason hesitated, reluctant to step back into a world he had worked so hard to leave behind. Amelia told him gently that she did not need a weapon working for her company. She needed someone who understood how to protect people first, long before ever worrying about protecting profits or property. That single sentence settled something deep within him. He asked why she trusted him so completely after everything they had endured together. Amelia answered simply that on the worst night of her life he could easily have walked away, yet he had chosen to stay instead. Mason finally accepted her offer, though he set one firm condition, that protecting the company's lowest-level employees would always matter just as much as protecting its leadership. Amelia agreed without hesitation. Hannah was soon promoted to oversee internal ethics and compliance, a role perfectly suited to her sharp instincts and quiet courage. Joseph took a brief leave of absence to spend time caring for his family before eventually returning as an independent legal advisor to the company. David Shaw helped formally clear the remaining sealed portions of Mason's record, finally restoring the dignity that had been stripped from him years earlier. The narrative gently implied that Mason remained a devoted and responsible father, though no child ever appeared directly within the unfolding story. Eventually, the story returned to the very same glass-walled restaurant where everything had first begun. Amelia returned there not to sign anything, but simply to thank the man who had once whispered 4 quiet words that changed her life forever. She sat at the same small table from that fateful night. Mason arrived a few minutes later wearing the same worn jacket as always, though something in his eyes seemed noticeably lighter now. Amelia glanced toward the glass wall behind her, the same reflective surface that had once revealed danger creeping closer with every passing second. This time, no one stood waiting in the shadows. Only the city outside glowed quietly beneath the evening sky. Mason sat down across from her and slid a folded napkin toward her, shaped once again into a small triangle, just like that very first night. Amelia smiled softly and asked whether she needed to look behind her this time. Mason answered that she did not, because no one stood behind her any longer, and the story closed gently on a quiet sense of healing, renewed trust, and the slow, careful beginning of something that might one day grow into more, without ever rushing toward it.